Well, hello everyone. I hope you're all doing pretty well. It's been a while since I made a video, and I just read another book on a topic that I thought would be interesting, and that was examining the the degree to which the United States federal government could be viewed as a coercive government versus a voluntary government. And this is, something that many people have talked about. I've talked about many times in general, and specifically about the United States. Um, the reason I'm making a video about it is because I'm doing a study of the antebellum period. And I just read a book titled One Nation Indivisible, The Union in American Thought, 1776 to 1861 by Paul T. Nagel. It's right here. This book was published in the early 1960s, and it's one of the very few, and perhaps the only book that really examines in explicitly as a topic, I'm sure other books deal with it ancillarily, about how Americans viewed basically the Union and more specifically the federal government from 1776 up until the Civil War. And I think that it's very pertinent in that regard when we talk about whether the Union was coercive or not. Um, it's very common in discourse, and I to hear people say things like, the government isn't coercive, it's voluntary, it came together. A lot of times people use the pronoun we. We got together, and we formed a government. Governments are formed this way, and to me, when people speak like that in general, not just about the United States, they're talking about a theoretical or a hypothetical scenario, and rarely and possibly never an actual scenario. When states are formed, from what we know, and if we're going way back, we don't know the exact details, but it seems very unlikely that they formed because some kind of majority, or even let alone a consensus or a unanimous support of this of people in a certain area got together and said, hey, put their brains together and said, we have a free rider problem, we have a defense problem, we've got a public goods problem. We should form a state to solve these problems because there's no other mechanism that we can use, or the other mechanisms that we can use aren't as effective as this. So let's form a state in this way. I don't know of any examples of that ever happening. Um, if we look at the formations of the first states, we don't know for sure. It seems highly unlikely, though, that that's what it is. One of the early popular theories was that it was a conquest theory, that you know, uh, maybe pastoralists who lived in the steppe or in more arid areas would come into an agricultural area where there was more settled population and establish hegemony over them, have establish coercive brute force over them, and institutionalize this. And in fact, a lot of people kind of argued that it was an institutionalized version of raiding. Marauders would come in every season and raid and pillage the urban centers or the agricultural centers in, say, Mesopotamia or the Nile River Valley, and eventually they just formalized the practice, moved in. And there is some evidence of this. If you look at, for instance, the pharaohs of Egypt, a lot of their, even though Egypt was an agricultural society and most of the people worked as agriculturalists, a lot of the iconography within the pharaonic institution is that of pastoralist, the staff, the flail, things that the pastoralists would use in herding animals. And it's kind of, I think one of the main reasons kind of people think that might be the origin. Now, this is widely disputed now, and I don't think you could argue that it was the case all the time. But even when it wasn't, that doesn't mean that state formation occurred with the popular election. Now, certainly not a democracy by what we would call it. And democracy, even if it did exist, is dubious to say that's everyone coming together. You get a majority in some electorate. Who decides the electorate? If the majority of people in this hamlet on the banks of the Euphrates River decide, we need a king, what about the people who are 1,000 yards down the river or 2,000 yards down the river? There's always the marginal person where this isn't necessarily clear. What about the people in that town who maybe wanted a different king or didn't want a king? How is the legitimacy established? It's not. There isn't really a good argument for that. Um, and I think that, I mean, I don't know anyone who proposes that states form democratically in that way. But when people make hypothetical arguments saying like we came together, we formed the state, I don't know what scenario they could be referencing that wouldn't be that. I mean, um, if you're talking like a tiny elite established military dominance or over a group, well, that's probably a very accurate way to describe it. My own personal opinion is that if it wasn't the conquest of outside groups, which probably did happen sometimes, but I don't, it's very hard to say going that far back. It's probably a case of specialization leading to certain um, powerful individuals, very likely related to war making, possibly related to religion. I think another candidate would be arbiters of some sort, having enough power within society that they can use their wealth and their status to form alliances with other groups and form effective um, coercive dominance, either through direct coercion or the threat of coercion over uh, the rest of the population in a given area. So you have, and I think there's a good possibility this would have been people who are more. You'd have a chieftaincy or some kind of war leader who's maybe fighting other, leading in defense or maybe leading in offense. He gets a, a group of young men who are kind of subordinate to him, and he kind of goes to them and says, let's work this out instead of trying to kill each other all the time and competing with each other. Let's cooperate. And this probably, if this happened, and I'm gonna guess it probably did, although whether this would be the genesis of every state, good question. Probably half the time it didn't work and half the time it did. But when it did, eventually it perpetuates. So that's all a very interesting question. In the case of the United States, obviously, we're not looking back that far, and people say we, and again, it's a very debatable thing because the colonial governments themselves weren't really based on, um, to use the pronoun we, again, projecting into the past is especially dubious because you're saying someone in the past did this and you include yourself, we. But even at the time, in the contemporary period, um, the colonial governments were often based on royal charters. They were based on the power of the king. Their borders were defined by the kings or by a proprietor, but often the proprietors, they were getting the land from the king anyway. So William Penn, he didn't homestead Pennsylvania. In fact, William Penn, I don't think ever went there, although his son did. Um, so and all this is backed up by the power of the sword. And it was not until the mid 17th century that the British Crown really started sending troops and establishing like actual direct military domination to an extent. Not that much was needed because there weren't that many people like rebelling, but um, that's where the colonial governments come from. That's where the assemblies that ratified the Constitution and the Articles of Confederation. That's where they come from. They don't come from the consensus or the assent of everyone. And I also think it's very interesting when people say we all came together when there were explicitly large groups of people, and if we were to total them all together, more than a majority of the people who explicitly had no say whatsoever. And again, it's questionable to say because you can vote, you have everything that happens in that system is then you've consented to it. I think that's a very dubious proposition. But if we say you can't vote, it's very hard to say, uh, based on the logic of democracy anyway, that you have that you're consenting. And yet we have vast groups of people at the time of the ratification of the Constitution, if we want to talk about the United States federal government, who weren't. The first two groups that come to mind, Native Americans, clearly 100% excluded, no say whatsoever, no. Um, I mean, the drafters of the Constitution thought about them and thought about how they should deal with them, but did not think in terms of how much say they would have in the government or that the government existed for their benefit. And so when someone says we come together to create this government, do they are they speaking for Lakota Sioux or Algonquin speakers or whoever else? And likewise, it's hard to see how that would be possible. And would they, say, well, you could critique the government if you're a Lakota, but if the exact same words came out of the mouth of an Anglo person, it would be invalid because your ancestors hypothetically could have been involved in the state. I don't know if that really makes a lot of sense. The other group obviously would be slaves, and by extension, default, almost all blacks. Obviously, there were freemen at the time of the ratification of the Constitution. I think overwhelmingly they would have been disenfranchised. I don't know if how many, if any, of the northern states allowed for the vote of free blacks. Maybe some of them, but in general, I think that would not have been allowed. Even if it was the majority were slaves and definitely did not have the right to vote. And so again, could a black person, if I was that guy T, could I sit here and say, um, the government wasn't established for me because I'm descended by a group that clearly had no enfranchisement, no say in the government, was merely a pawn to be coerced and nothing more. Um, Again, I don't know why it would be valid if he were to say something and then I wasn't just because of the color of my skin, but there you go. And then, of course, we have women. Women couldn't vote. You could argue that Abigail Adams could bitch and moan and withhold sex from John Adams and, maybe like persuade him to, she have influence in that way, but she certainly did not have direct influence in the state. She couldn't vote. Um, and then even beyond that, even among white men, the franchise was restricted in most colonies to people who were essentially wealthy or at least moderately wealthy. You had to own property. You could not just be a person. You had to be ruled by the state, but you didn't necessarily get to have a say. And so when people say we and we came together, I think that this is a very implausible reading of the facts of history. That you're talking about a minority of a minority of a minority that exists either directly with force or with a threat of force, and the rubric by which people will say, well, everyone in that society is consenting to this, is a rubric of consent that they don't use any other example. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a minute here. But um, yeah, like the federal government disenfranchised almost all these people. Um, there's a whole other argument. There's another video to be had on the whole idea of like, democracy isn't a great idea. It doesn't work very well. There's a strong argument to be made like, okay, like I have a neighbor. He's an alcoholic. He has no job. He lives on welfare. All he does is get drunk all day and berate his wife, and he's a complete fuck up and loser. He knows nothing about politics or economics or history or science. Um, he just flits flits his life away, and you know what? He can vote. And there's an argument to be made like, why on earth should his vote count the same as somebody else who maybe knows more, has more invested in it? This is the whole aristocratic federalist argument against direct democracy, and it's a persuasive one, but that well, like I said, there's a whole other video there because then the arguments for an oligarchy or an aristocracy or the fact that someone is property doesn't give them necessarily the right to govern others, or if we're talking utilitarianism, doesn't give them the wisdom to govern others. The fact that you can run a business, that you can run a farm, and that you can manage slaves doesn't mean that you'd be good at governing or that the government that you would institute would be better than just allowing people to have, more autonomy. That's a separate video I want to make. I have some more reading I want to do before I do that. But if you're just the all this is just to say it's very dubious to kind of pers- um, portray the founding of the United States and the drafting of the Constitution as some kind of collective thing that renders legitimacy forever. Most of I mean, even among the people who did have a say, who were enfranchised, it was hotly debated. There were the anti-federalists, and the Jeffersonians, and a whole host of other people who or rural people who had very little idea of even what was going on or little care. To say then they're then included and that they are bound in perpetuity, both them and their children, is very dubious. But what this book deals with, and I think it's just one more layer on top of that, is the political union. So I don't want to pretend, not take for granted that the states themselves are illegitimate, but from 1776 and then the drafting of the Constitution later, up until the Civil War, there was tremendous debate about the nature of the Union. And the book talks about a lot of things about what kind of metaphors were used, what kind of iconography was used. People talked about the Union as a ship. People talked about it as the last hope of humanity. Americans have had a very strong sense that they were the city on the hill, that they were the last great hope um, of the world, and that the Union was what made that possible. And on the other hand, you had kind of two alternate. Many people viewed the Union as a means to an end. That the main end was liberty, human liberty, and that the way to guarantee that liberty was through the Union. This is especially true early on, when there were large fears that some major European state, primarily Great Britain, might intercede and take over the country again. The idea being that they would quash liberty. But by having an arrangement, a cooperative arrangement where we all get together and we have mutual defense, we can make that so that won't happen, which was true. I mean, Great Britain did not have the power to assert itself coercively over the American colonies. It didn't during the Revolution. That's why it lost the Revolutionary War. It probably didn't even long before that. There's a lot of speculation in the 1670s. There was the so-called Bacon's Rebellion, and there's a lot of speculation that if that had really been more popular than it was actually quite a local phenomenon. It's dubious to assume that the English would have been able, even 100 years before the Revolution, to assert domination, physical, coercive, political domination over the eastern seaboard of the United States. Maybe they could, maybe they couldn't, but they couldn't by 1776. They couldn't in the War of 1812. Uh, and but there was a fear that they could, and the idea was, look, if South Carolina and Georgia and Virginia work together with New England and New York and the middle colonies in Pennsylvania, that we'll be safe. But the Union then was a means to an end. The Union was there to help facilitate that defensive strategy um, against probably Great Britain, maybe France or Spain, but whatever. Um, and uh, so as a means to that end. On the other hand, you had people say the Union itself is the end. And now this was a much less common idea, especially early on. This would be like the Union is absolute. The Union is the manifestation. This is kind of like a proto-nationalism. Um, but what's very, very interesting is as the 19th century progresses, the threat to the United States posed by foreign powers receded to zero if we're talking about an existential threat. I mean, Great Britain all along could have caused huge problems in terms of commerce. You could have had raiding, but the idea that they could reconquer or take over even a small chunk would be just ridiculous. And this lack of a credible external threat that was existential. Again, Native American tribes could cause problems. The Spanish could cause problems. The French could cause problems. The English could cause problems. The idea that they're going to take over, very, very remote. This did allow for there to be a great deal more acrimony within the group. Like, we don't need to get along. We're not going to become invaded if we split up. And this did engender more debate about the efficacy of the Union. It's one thing to pay high tariffs here in the South to a federal government that's redistributing that wealth to the North, if the alternative is invasion by the British. If, however, invasion by the British is not something that's particularly likely, then the question comes, why are we paying, why is there a tax flow from us, a wealth transfer from the South to the North? And that wasn't the only wealth transfer that existed, but that's one of them. So that became a question. And what is very fascinating, this book it talks about all the, some people viewed it as a chain, like a good chain. Some people believed it as like a restrictive chain. And then there became this debate about whether states could leave or not. And this is actually an interesting philosophical question. Let's say that you and I go to lunch together. I use that as an example because I'm going to lunch with somebody today. Totally voluntary. They agree to join. I agree to go. We go. We have a conversation. In the course of the conversation, I start saying things along the lines of, I really don't want you to leave. I don't think it would be a good idea. I think it would be a bad idea if you left. I think that if you left, you would suffer. There would be bad consequences. And that in and of itself, depending on how exactly I'm talking about, might not be a threat. I could say, I'm a really positive influence on you. If you leave, you're gonna, I don't know, become a drug addict again, or lose your job, or you'll be unhappy. Okay, that's persuasion. That's, I guess that you wouldn't really call that a threat. But if I started saying, if you leave for your own benefit, I'm gonna stop you. If you try and walk off this table and you try and get in your car and leave, I'm gonna tackle you and tie you up. and make sure that you don't leave. That would be coercion. And if I made it explicit that I would stop you, that would be the threat of coercion. I would be threatening you. It would be the same thing. And this is basically what happened in the lead up to the Civil War. Nobody knew that the Civil War was going to happen. Nobody was sure that the northern states or the northern politicians would try and stop any state, in this case the southern states, from leaving. Um, but and that's very fascinating because when the first states left, I think that they did everything that could be expected of what would be necessary in a voluntary arrangement. You know, they offered to repay their share of the federal debt. They offered to pay for all federal property in their area, all the post office, all the forts, everything. Um, and if you have a voluntary union, a union that's based, and that's the very interesting, just the term itself, union, indicates disparate parts coming together. Um, if they say we're going to leave this part, that's not aggressive on their part. And we can say whatever you want about how bad South Carolina and the South is because of slavery. Slavery is hugely important. I don't want to be one of those people, revisionists, who minimizes its centrality to the issues at hand. But in this context, it actually is uh, not that important of an issue. I mean, no one says that the Revolutionary War was not correct and that that secession was wrong because slavery was widely practiced in the United States. Indeed, more widely practiced than it was at the time of the Civil War in terms of proportion of the country that practiced it. Um, and again, that analysis breaks down at so many other levels because there were still so many slaves in the North. If you include the border states, Maryland, Missouri, and Kentucky, the North had 400,000 slaves in it at the start of the Civil War, and it was largely legal. You had slave auctions; slaves could be brought into those areas. Um, so the idea that slavery is confusing the issue in that regard. Yes, if you want to condemn the Confederacy on those grounds, absolutely you may. That makes sense. But to say that they can't leave, different. But what's interesting, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, like the deep southern states, secede. They decide to leave. The northern southern states, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, they don't. They do leave, however, when Abraham Lincoln makes it clear that he's going to try and suppress this secession by force. When he calls forth for the raising of an army to prevent this from happening. That's when Virginia leaves. So for them, the question was clearly, look, if this is, they wanted to stay. I mean, they made it very clear in some of these legislatures, in Virginia in particular, we don't want to leave. We want to stay because we like the union. We believe in the union, you know. But if it's going to be a union of coercion, if it's not going to be a marriage but an abduction, we don't want to have any part of it. We don't want to be part of a union of the sword. And when it became clear that's what it was, then they tried to leave. And at the very end of this book, he talks about William Seward, and William Seward was from the North, I believe he was from New York, and it was very strongly an absolute unionist. He believed in the union was perpetual. You know, one of those people who thought, you know, the union anteceded the Constitution. But he also recognized, he almost pleaded, don't leave, don't leave. If you leave, we will have to stop you, and then it will be a despotism. Stopping secession will cause there to be a despotism, as indeed there was. And this was a recognition by many who were absolute unionists. And I think this is very telling because it's true. We don't talk about the union anymore. Talk of the union ceased with the Civil War. We have a single hegemonic central state. We have a central state that has the accoutrements of a federal system. You know, we have the different states, and it's even very interesting that they're called states. States, not provinces. I don't know of any other country that uses that nomenclature. Um, but it's a central government that has no, you can't leave. It's not a federation. You're in it by force. And this has been proved. People say, like, you know, people that it's consensual, like, no, you can't leave. It's funny too. I get no one at the time. No one told the South Carolinians it would be fine if they moved to Somalia. Um, like it's there by force. You can't leave. You can't vote. Doesn't matter what the majority in your state thinks or the elected representatives of your state. And we have all this rhetorical reverence for people who get elected. Well, the elected representatives in these seceding states decided, some of them with a high majority, to leave. And, not everyone in the South agreed with secession, absolutely, just like not everyone in the North agreed with them being stopped from seceding. In fact, many abolitionists called for many years before the Civil War to have no union with slave power. There is a recognition on the part both of the most hardcore advocates of slavery and its most die-hard opponents that union was necessary for slavery, that slavery needed uh, an umbrella government to make it profitable. And I will talk more about this as I read more about slavery. But um, the the union was based on a war. I mean, you can't say that it's consent. And this is so weird. Like, they rebelled actively. They took up arms and fought and died by the hundreds of thousands and killed by the hundreds of thousands, destroyed so much of their property in the process. And people say, well, they still consented because they failed. Because the only thing that doesn't count as consent in the minds of the social contract people is that you have to successfully rebel. It's not enough to say you don't consent. It's not enough to vote and say you don't consent. It's not enough to rebel and form your own government for a couple years. That's not good enough evidence. You must succeed in the long run. Otherwise, you are not consenting. Now, imagine using that metric for any other situation, and it would be nonsensical. You could rape someone, they could cut, they could scream, they could claw at you, they could stab at you, they could try and kill you, they could say in the most explicit terms that they don't want to be raped, that they don't want to be with you. And if you were simply able to overpower them, then it wouldn't be rape. Right? I mean, does anyone really believe that? I don't think so. Um, there is an argument that some people make, it's pretty rare, that, well, might makes right. The fact that they have the power to do it makes it okay. Their ability to coerce, and the fact that your fortitude was not strong enough to resist their aggression, that's consent. Very few people make that argument. Most people don't laud the government, say the government is great because anyone who tried to rebel it would be slaughtered in mass. I mean, like that the government is legitimate because anyone who tried to escape would lose in the struggle. Although that is something that's highly, highly based on the circumstances of such a hypothetical rebellion. Um, I don't even know if states were to secede today. I don't know what would happen. I'm not sure the federal government would be willing or able to do anything about it. Yes, they have nukes and everything, but like, how, I'm not speculating what would happen. I'm saying that the situation is so radically different now that it's hard to project what would happen. You know, um, like, but nobody, very few people, argue that the state's legitimate for that reason, and instead they advocate the state. Um, they say it's a great idea. But they do it by substituting what it really did and how it really formed and how it's really enforced with a hypothetical, mythical, fiction. That they all just got together and had a consensus, and they all decided. We decided. We came together again. So we're now excluding women, blacks, Native Americans, propertyless whites, and everyone in the South. You know, and their descendants. So fascinating, fascinating. And I think the admission on the parts of people like Seward that uh, it would be a despotism. This has been borne out. This the the state has become a true leviathan. Maybe one thing that could be said for all the problems with the Federalist system, with the Alexander Hamilton minimal government, but with a property elite controlling it. There's a lot of problems with that, and again, I do want to make a video juxtaposing that with popular democracy. That at least that system is less likely to lead to the type of despotism that we've seen since then, or a war that kills. Now they've upped the estimates now 685,000, maybe even more. They're looking at like population figures and trying to figure out like how many males are missing from the society that should be there, and it's a huge number. Never mind the property. The property of the South was hugely destroyed. The property of the North was hugely altered in a way that was suboptimal. Let's just say that, which is similar to destruction. Industries became tailored to war making and whatnot, and at the expense, resources went towards that instead of towards the advancement of science or the advancement of what people's needs and people's desires. The capital was going towards cannons and guns and pistols, which I love guns and cannons and all that, but it wasn't going to better harvesting equipment or dams or whatever else would have helped people. So, not to the same extent anyway. I'm not saying that they didn't make consumer goods during the Civil War, but that fewer were made. Um, so a very interesting admission on the part of Seward there. I don't know if there are other pro-union people who made this admission. I think if you look at someone like Lincoln, he seems to have kind of taken the view that like, yes, I'm assuming all of these extraordinary powers, even tyrannical powers, but it's for an emergency, that it's for the short term. But as Robert Higgs points out beautifully in Crisis in Leviathan, you have a ratchet effect with government. Once it's taken, once it takes two steps forward, maybe it takes a step back, but it's still a step ahead where it was. But yeah, you definitely can't pretend like, I mean, to say, well, the Southerners had slavery, therefore it wasn't coercion. There's no logical connection between those two. You know, if the person that I tied up at lunch, I can't say he abuses. He's got a little brother that he picks on, or he's a criminal in his own right. Therefore, my attacking him is okay. No, it doesn't work that way. So, interesting book, interesting topic, definitely. It's interesting that people stop even using the term union. That we don't, and Shelby Foote points this out in his Civil War documentary by Ken Burns. Prior to the Civil War, people would refer to the United States are. The United States are this. The United States are that. And after the Civil War, it became the United States is. The United States is this. The United States is that. Uh, the linguistic shift from plural to singular when referring to the United States. Even though right in the name it's plural, United States, not United State. That would you wouldn't even. Well, I guess it would make sense. I guess hypothetically to call something United State, but even United, you're talking about a disparate group, the Union. But the Union there is no Union, and it proved. If I go back to my analogy, if I argue and argue and argue with my lunch date, and at the end of the day he leaves and I let him go, then and I don't raise a hand other than a persuasive word to stop him, then I didn't coerce him. It was a consensual union. Our time together was consensual. Our lunch was not a crime. One is not the aggressor of the other. If I stop him though, at that point, if not before, it was coercive. It was not voluntary. And that's what we had in the United States. Now, it is an interesting point. Had South Carolina seceded in 1832, Andrew Jackson said that he would not allow that to happen and that he would kill them all and hang them from trees. We don't know if he would have or not. His character says he would have, but who knows? Maybe it would have been difficult. You know, uh, I think you could say though, well, maybe at one point, maybe they could have left and maybe nothing would have happened. And then you could argue, well, the union wasn't coercive because somebody left, right? And nobody raised a hand to stop them. And then we would be able to say, well, the union wasn't coercive at that point, at least at the political level between its parts or between members, which is again important. Which one you pick and which one you think is more accurate is actually pretty important. Um, but the moment that they refuse to allow someone to leave, then whatever it may or may not have been up to that point is the question is settled. It wasn't a voluntary union. People debated this ad nauseum, and there might have been a point when it was. Again, I'm talking among the various states, not to individuals, But the moment Lincoln says I'm going to raise an army, and it's not just Lincoln, because he was supported by many of the North, most of the North, enough anyway, to raise gigantic armies, largest armies yet seen, and aggressively invade the South. I mean, this was in many ways the largest war that had ever happened up to that point in the world. It's still the largest war that's ever happened in the Western Hemisphere by a huge margin. Um, then there, you can't argue what it was. May have been one or the other. It's hard to say. What it is now, definitely, without a doubt, without any question whatsoever, is a union of the sword. So uh, anyway, I just thought that would be kind of a good thing to talk about. It is an interesting book. Uh, Again, very few people really seem to consider this. There's a lot of other interesting things. There was a lot of deification of Washington. Washington became an iconographic figure that everyone kind of the Union through Washington. Um, uh, the founding fathers as a generation, and this was true as well. Uh, and yeah, like there's all these religious undertones. I don't know, why Americans are so um, view themselves as so special in the world. I mean, they kept talking like, "Oh, everyone in the world will be sad if the Union fails." Like, I don't think people in fucking Germany give two shits about whether there's two United States or not. But yeah, or in Russia or whatever else. So anyway, sorry it's been so long. I will make more videos. I just don't know how often I will. And just there'll probably come a couple on slavery. I do want to do the democracy versus aristocracy. I've been reading a lot about the Jacksonian era, and there's a lot of really meaty stuff in there that's worth talking about. I just I want to learn a lot more about it before I put a video out there. As with slavery, I bought almost 20 books just on slavery, American slavery, um, about its economics, about everything, about its cultural aspects, about its decline, about its rise, uh, all that kind of stuff. And I'm reading books on that right now. So we'll see. I don't know when they'll come out, but I hope you're all having a great time, and I'll talk to you all later. Oh, and happy Columbus Day.